Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for people to slowly come in. You hear any noises? If they're coming from my dog. Although I don't know if this laptop picks that up or not.
Now you're obligated to tell us what kind of dog.
Yes.
Yes. He's a Shih Tzu Bichon mix.
Oh.
He is small and very stubborn.
But now we've just lost Mandy for the rest of this presentation.
I'm probably gonna need a picture before we continue.
Yeah. I mean, we're still early, so I can bring him up.
Oh, yay.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
It kind of disappears in the virtual background.
Yeah.
Oh, what's his name?
Timmy.
Timmy.
Oh my God.
He's
All
so
right.
cute.
It's over. If you want to have Timmy do this whole thing, we will happily bow,
Yes.
stand aside.
We need a Timmy.
Yeah.
He's 12, so I call him my old man.
Oh.
Hi folks. If you want to tell us where you're tuning in from, that'd be awesome. I know we usually have people from Connecticut, but yeah, let us know where you are.
Bring up the chat. We can maybe see.
I'm in East Hartford. I'm not at the Mark Twain House. That's all closed up for the night.
Maryland,
Yeah,
Saludos from
LA.
LA. My home for 14 years.
Raul. Hi, Emily. Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and get started as people are, feel free to tell us where you're tuning in from. Let us know what brought you here today. Please chat in, chat away in the chat as I do the introductions. Hi, if this is your first time here, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for the summer of 1876, Outlaws, Lawmen, and Legends in the Season That Defined the American West. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs like this one, the House and Museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. As much as we would love you to visit the house, if you happen to be far away, you can still take advantage of these awesome discounts by becoming a member. And now on to our guests. Our author, Chris Wimmer, is the writer, host, and producer of Legends of the Old West and Infamous America podcasts. He has a communications degree from the University of Iowa and a master's degree from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University. He is an award-winning journalist who changed careers after 14 years in Hollywood's film industry. He uses thorough research and cinematic sound design to bring American history to life. And in 2018, he partnered with his sister, Mandy, to create Black Barrel Media as a home for their podcast ventures. And he is joined on screen by Mandy Wimmer, who is a producer and marketer. She spent 15 years producing presidential campaigns and Super Bowls before founding Black Barrel Media. Between Super Bowls, she served as the deputy director of Arizona Centennial Commission and Foundation, where they produced the largest event in Arizona history. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat, as I said earlier. But if you have a specific question, if you can, just please pop that into the Q&A section. We don't want it to get lost in the chat. Please also know that you can click on captions to see live auto captioning for this event. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I'll be putting a link in the chat to purchase The Summer of 1876 through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guest. Now that is all from me. I will turn this over to Chris and Mandy and enjoy.
Thank you, Omar. Yeah,
Thank you.
that was a great intro because now I don't have to say half of
Yeah.
that stuff. We had actually prepared some of that stuff to have to say. We're never quite sure how the intros are going to go. So thank you for knocking out a lot of my workload that I have to do in the very beginning. And hello, like we said, we're seeing some of the people in the chats chiming in from wherever they live. So we've seen a couple people from the LA area.
Mhm.
And so that was interesting. It was a throwback to having lived in LA for 14 years. Mandy lived there for a short period too.
Yeah.
I didn't know Omar was going to go all the way back to the University of Iowa communications degree. I honestly forgot that I got a communications degree from Iowa. That, oh my God,
That seems like a lifetime ago.
feels like so long ago. So he went to the Wayback Machine for that one. So thanks, Omar. So yeah, we'll jump right in. This is, like he said, I'm glad also that Omar teed it up with, it's going to be as interactive as we can make it. That's part of the reason we're both here. And it's not just me trying to deliver like a college lecture or something like that. For Black Barrel Media, we produce a little video series that we do very irregularly. It is very infrequent. It's when we can, and we call them fireside chats. Obviously, it's a pretty obvious name. It's been around for quite a while. It's popular. We usually sit outside at an outdoor patio with an outdoor fireplace. Obviously, in the wintertime, we are in Phoenix, Arizona. It is 104 outside right now, so we are not out at the outdoor fireplace. We actually have a little fireplace behind us that we thought about lighting for everyone and try to set the ambiance, but you can't really see it anyway. And we didn't want to cook live on this video for you, so we decided to skip that part.
But the sentiment was there, which is important to share.
We tried. We tried to give a little bit. So that's why we're both here with this little bit of different dynamic that we do this for a video series. We thought it would be a little bit interesting to try this for this presentation rather than, again, me doing a kind of one-man band thing. Mandy and I can go back and forth. She's got a whole bunch of questions that will allow us to get into the book in what we hope will be a little more entertaining way. It's a little odd. We can't see any of you, so we have no idea if you're going to fall asleep halfway through this, and we're just going to end up performing for ourselves here, and it's going to be awkward. So hopefully we can keep everyone awake for at least a half an hour or so till we get into your questions. So save up your questions. As Omar said, throw them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them toward the end here in the last 15 minutes or so. So I think without further ado, Omar gave such a great intro. I don't really have anything more to add to that other than the setup of our little fireside chat dynamic. We'll see how it works out. So let's roll.
All right. So we typically do these on happy hour with bourbon. So we're not doing that. We're not doing that today. So if I fall flat on my face, it's because I lack bourbon, and that's the only reason. So
again, we have no idea what that joke worked.
Yeah, exactly. No, maybe.
Flat. So this is going to be hysterical.
We're going to assume that everybody's
laughing. What you
laughing.
should know about the fireside chat dynamic is that Mandy is usually the host. She's like the play-by-play person. And I'm usually the color commentator who chimes in with the ultra funny, super witty banter. It's usually very dry and sarcastic. It is not anything like that, but that's usually how this works. So we're kind of changing it up a little bit. I'm going to do far more talking than I usually do, hence my little glass of water and probably an allergy attack at some point during this.
Just to spice it up.
Yeah.
So, okay. So we will dive in. So again, one thing that we typically want to ask people is if you've had a chance to read the book or not, because that kind of tailors some of these questions. So if you want to throw in the chat, if you've had a chance to read it or not, that would kind of help us a little bit and to know kind of where to go and how detailed to get. But really just to start, assuming that most people have the book, but have not had a chance to read it. The one thing that Chris writes, Legends of the Old West podcast, and obviously we cover all of the American West. And so what I would like to know is, what is it about this particular topic that made you want to cram in writing a book into our already insane schedule?
Yeah, it turns out that when you start producing 2 long form storytelling podcasts, as we learned, it is a mountain of work, so much more work than we ever dreamed, that writing a book on top of that turns out to be a little bit of an extra chore. But it actually was directly out of the Legends of the Old West podcast that the book idea basically hit me like an epiphany. So for the Legends of the Old West podcast and for Infamous America, mostly for Legends of the Old West, we tell long form stories, multi-episode stories about the true stories of the Old West. We pick the gunfight at the OK Corral or the life and career of Jesse James. And we give you a long story about, we truncate the version of that story. So you don't have to necessarily read 4 or 5 books about it. We give you 5 or 6 episodes with music behind it. We try to make it very entertaining, but give you detail and give you the full story. So having done a lot of research about Jesse James and about the Native American Wars and the Great Plains era, Red Cloud's War, Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, and knowing that I was eventually going to do the Battle of the Little Bighorn story on the Legends of the Old West podcast, I had dabbled in a lot of these different things. I told those stories on Legends of the Old West, and then on the Infamous America podcast, we had done the story of the 1919 World Series baseball scandal, the Black Sox scandal, which everybody seemed to really love, which was really fun for us. That was a highlight of our careers thus far. And so having done all those stories and knowing that I was going to do the Battle of the Little Bighorn coming up, it honestly just hit me in the summer of 2019 that so many of the things I had already written about on the podcast happened in a tiny space of time. They all happened in a very short space of time. So you had this one summer in 1876 when some major events of the era, which also turned out to be some major events in American history that featured some of the most prominent people of the Old West era, all happened in this short space of time. So I decided I'd never seen a book like that before. I had read all the individual books. If you pick up a book about Wyatt Earp, you're going to get everything you ever want to know about Wyatt Earp, and the Little Bighorn, the same thing, and Wild Bill Hickok and Jesse James and the whole works. But because those are specifically geared to talk about one subject, they obviously don't get into any of the other things that were happening. I thought, man, the context is really interesting to see how all these huge stories overlapped. That's really interesting to me. So that was where the genesis of the book was. This could be an actual book topic, and I'd never written a book before. It was something that that I guess had always been somewhat in the back of my mind. I'd always enjoyed English and history growing up and in school. But then the idea, I thought, man, we could actually do this. This would be really fun.
Well, then when you think about, all of these things happening in the Old West, the American West is really a 100-year period of time. And
it's a little bit shorter, about 1865 to 1900, really.
So a very short period of time. And then you narrow it down even to one summer, all of really the biggest things of the American West happened. And you think about, now if all of these things were going down, we have social media, we have cell phones, like we can call each other and we can talk about, oh my gosh, you'll never believe what's happening over here. But then you didn't have that. So the communication, getting these things back and forth, like, how do you think that played out?
Well, that was also part of the genesis of it, was that if you place yourself in Missouri, that's kind of a sweet spot for this story. If you were living in Missouri in the summer of 1865, once the month of July hit, you would have seen so many articles about crazy things for the people that we now think of as legendary people.
Right.
Jesse James was kind of a legend in his own time. But you would have been barraged with these and bombarded with all these newspaper stories. So the newspapers would have been full of train robberies from Jesse James and these catastrophic battles happening on the Great Plains. And then, of course, a lot of the other things that are going on. We're going to get into all the different layers in just a second that'll hopefully tee up some of this for you in case you're really interested in reading the book. I'll dive deeper into the concept of it, which we could do. Do you want to do that now?
Yeah, we're already there. So let's just go into
the basic concept of the book, as you can see, if you've read anything about it, it follows some major storylines. And so what I really want to hone in on right now is to give you a preview of what is essentially a 90-day window of time between mid-June and mid-September. Let me try and get myself in frame. Mid-June, mid-September. That's what we're going. That's the sweet spot of this. And there's a lot of different things that happen in that time period. So again, place yourself in Missouri and you're a newspaper reader. So in mid-June, June 17th, the Battle of the Rosebud happened. And for those who are not familiar with the story of the campaign, the U.S. Army campaign against the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, George Armstrong, Custer, all that, I won't spoil it too much. But the great campaign of that summer, the first major engagement was the Battle of the Rosebud on June 17th. 8 days later, June 25th, was the Battle of the Little Bighorn. 2 weeks after that was the Rocky Cut robbery. Jesse James robbed a train in Missouri on July 7th. 2 days, actually, I shouldn't say that. Should get ahead of myself. That exact same day, July 7th, is when the news of the Battle of the Little Bighorn broke wide. National newspapers from across the country were writing huge stories about it in headlines. So you had Jesse James robbing a bank on the same day that the news broke about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Just the next week, we think probably the next week, there's no firm date on when it happened, but Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane arrived in Deadwood for the final 3 weeks or so of Wild Bill Hickok's life. 10 days after the news broke about the Battle of the Little Bighorn and Jesse James robbed a train in Missouri, Buffalo Bill Cody gets into a one-on-one fight with a Cheyenne warrior, which went on to be called sometimes the Battle of Warbonnet Creek. It has a very lofty name for what essentially was a one-on-one fight, but it was a crazy thing that happened. So in July, you start with July 7th with the robbery. The same day the news breaks. Essentially the next week, Hickok and Calamity Jane arrive in Deadwood. A few days after that, Buffalo Bill Cody gets into this epic one-on-one fight. A couple weeks after that, Wild Bill Hickok is murdered in Deadwood. 2 to 3 weeks after that, Jesse James and his gang arrive in Minnesota to eventually rob the Northfield Bank. So after that July robbery, the heat was really on the James gang in Missouri. The heat had been on them at previous times, but nothing like what happened to them in July of 1876.
Right.
So there's some evidence to suggest that they had already been planning on leaving Missouri to go somewhere else to rob a bank, specifically Minnesota. But at the very least, when you combine the heat that was on them after the Rocky Cut train robbery with the idea that they were probably going to leave anyway, then they end up running. Well, we don't know exactly how they got to Minnesota, but they either rode their horses or more likely rode their trains. And they got there in August, second half of August. 2 weeks after they get there, we know for sure that the James gang was in Minnesota on August 24th, 1876. Looking back at the records, we found well, not me. I did not. Historians years ago found hotel records that showed the outlaws checking into 2 different hotels in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Exactly 2 weeks later, they robbed the bank in Northfield, Minnesota, and got into an epic shootout with the townspeople. I'm assuming a lot of you have at least some understanding and some knowledge of that event. But again, I won't get into too much detail in case you're just hearing about it for the first time. And then the gang spends the next 2 weeks on the run after that epic shootout and somewhat failed robbery in Northfield as they're running through southern Minnesota, being chased by posses and hundreds of lawmen. But 2 days after the bank robbery happens is an engagement, again, 500 miles to the west, just north of Deadwood, straight north of Deadwood by 100 or so miles. It's called the Battle of Slim Buttes. This was the U.S. Army's one and only major engagement retaliation for the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So 2 days after Jesse James gets into this epic failed bank robbery, technically he did rob the bank. They got the money from the bank. I call it a failed bank robbery
because there was barely any money.
There was barely any money, and it turned into a total disaster for the gang. It was essentially the end of the James Younger gang. But 2 days after that is an engagement in the Dakota Territory, where General George Crook's army column attacked the village of a chief called American Horse, who had been a prominent fighter in Red Cloud's War 10 years earlier, and had been a prominent fighter for all the Northern Plains engagements. So that happened on September 9th. So now we're getting to the end. I promise you, we're not going too much further with this. So on September 20th, almost exactly 90 days after the Battle of the Rosebud, is the last confirmed sighting of the James brothers as they're escaping the Northfield raid. After that, it's kind of anyone's guess as to exactly where they went and exactly how they got there. But that 90-day period from mid-June to mid-September is crazy. And so just everything I just said to you, all that long rambling monologue, that's only half of it. While all of those big things are happening in the background, Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson are patrolling the streets of Dodge City together for the first time. 1876 is the first major cattle season in Dodge City. The city fathers have realized they are now the hub of Texas cattle drives. As such, they need a whole new group of lawmen. The lawmen who had been in Dodge City previously had either been killed or were not up to the challenge, so they had to restock with lawmen, and they hired almost an all-star team. So Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson are setting records for arrests in Dodge City during that whole summer. And then in Philadelphia is the 6-month Centennial Exhibition, the World's Fair, the first World's Fair on American soil, where all kinds of new inventions are being rolled out. All that stuff is also happening in the background. Additionally, which we will touch on a little bit further in a second, it's the first season of play for the National League that we still watch today. National League Baseball played its first season in the spring, summer, and fall of 1876. It was not the first professional baseball league in American history. It was just the first one to stand the test of time. It survived. All the others folded after a season or two. And even though the National League went through its own trials and tribulations over the years, it stayed together. So it is a little bit of a piece of a history that we can reach out and touch.
But I have to cut you off, and
Okay.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm going to, because you're killing
Please.
one of my questions that I was going to ask. And so I'm cutting you off. And so there's one thing that I want to say that just popped into my head as you were kind of going through the 90 days. And then I want to address a couple of things in the chat, because I'm super excited that someone said, Anne said that she loved the intro and love our style. So yes, our jokes are working. I love it. Thank you, Anne. And
hopefully that's what you meant, Anne.
I hope so.
We're gonna take
And
it that
Dr. J is a fourth of the way through the book. And we've got Jennifer, who has just learned about it and is excited to read it. Anne is the same way. Let's see, also learned about the book, looking forward to buying it. Jackie, thank you. And then Raul. So signed copies of the book. We did a pre-sale with signed copies of the book, and there are establishments right now that have signed copies of the book, and we are trying to figure out how to have people still be able to order them. For instance, Changing Hands in Phoenix has a group of signed copies from Chris. So we're still working on that. So if we can just reach out to Omar after this, and hopefully we have more information on that and how you can get signed copies.
Yeah, I'll just quickly address it right now. Then we'll jump back in.
Okay.
Well, I know I have signed a ton of copies for our local bookstore, our local independent bookstore here in Phoenix, Arizona. It's called Changing Hands.
Yeah.
They have 2 locations. So the fastest way that I can think of right now to tell you how to get a signed copy is to go to our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. At the top, there's a big banner where you can order the book. When you click on that link, look for the button that says signed copy Changing Hands.
Okay.
They
They're still
have
doing it
tons
then.
of
Okay,
they
good.
have tons of signed copies. You can order through them and get one. I got a cramp in my hand signing a book. They should have plenty, unless you're planning to order 100, in which case you're now our new best friend.
Yeah.
And then I will go back and sign more. Okay, that's a quick detour.
Okay. So then just one thing that I was thinking of as you were going through everything is, wasn't Jesse James the outlaw, I guess, and the robber who was known to announce himself or to almost write press releases about what he just did? And then I'm kind of wondering, is that correct? First of all, am I remembering that right?
Yes, and I'll hold the rest of it until I hear part 2.
Okay. So part 2 is that, do you think that he almost kind of set up his own fate? At all? I mean, do you think news was moving fast enough? Oops, so sorry. I'm a very big gesture. Apologies, everyone. That by the Northfield raid, people almost maybe saw him coming, or do you think there was any piece of that?
Specifically to that, some people in Northfield were suspicious of the James gang, but not necessarily because they thought it was Jesse James and the gang.
Okay.
They were just suspicious of these, depending on how many they saw together, groups of guys who all looked roughly the same and looked different from everyone else who was in the area. So it was like these guys clearly stood out in this small town. Some people thought there was maybe something fishy about them, but maybe not necessarily that they were the James gang.
Okay, got it.
Now, back to the first part. Part of the reason we know so much more about Jesse James than, for instance, Billy the Kid, is that Jesse James loved the attention and he loved corresponding directly with the media. He both wrote letters to the editors of various newspapers, and he worked very closely with a guy. Oh, I'm not even gonna say his name because I'm gonna forget it. I don't want to screw it up. This is doing it on the fly.
Yeah.
And now I got part of it, but I don't want to screw it up. So basically, he became really good friends with a newspaper editor in Missouri, and they worked together to kind of craft the early legend of Jesse James. So that's part of the reason why we know so much more about him than Billy the Kid. Billy didn't interact with newspapers. He didn't have that kind of relationship. His legend has grown far more after the fact and over the generations than Jesse James's has. That's a weird possessive.
Yeah.
But Jesse James was as close as Jesse James and Wild Bill Hickok were about as close as you could get to living legends, people who were legends in their own time, as we probably had in the Old West era. Wyatt Earp was not a legend in his own time. That happened much, much later. Buffalo Bill Cody would be another one because he became such a famous stage performer. But you know, he put himself out there as a performer. It wasn't just necessarily because of his everyday actions, which seems like an odd thing to call a bank robber, but that's what Jesse James was. So.
Okay, so then this is another aside, something that I absolutely did not have planned, but this is how our fireside chats go. I just think of something. So if you're a fan of Infamous America, so we have Legends of the Old West and Infamous America. We did the story of John Dillinger on Infamous America. And now I'm thinking, isn't there a correlation between Dillinger and Jesse James? Wasn't Jesse James Dillinger's idol or something like that?
Yes. John Dillinger grew up somewhat idolizing Jesse James. He had, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he'd read some of the old dime novels.
That's
it
what
was. It was that kind of stuff. Jesse James was enough of a name in the probably the 1920s when Dillinger was growing up, that he somewhat idolized and maybe to some degree started emulating Jesse James later in life.
Right.
But one of the other classic things that you hear about in the Old West, this is a total detour. So we're going way off script here. But my favorite story of the Old West is a story we did in episode 1 of Legends of the Old West.
The best.
Speaking of another raid, it's the Coffeyville raid, where the Dalton gang tried to rob 2 banks at the same time in Coffeyville, Kansas. And the quote that you always read about that event supposedly came from Bob Dalton, the leader of the gang, when he said he wanted to do something I can't remember his exact quote. Basically, he wanted to best Jesse James.
Yeah.
Jesse James never robbed more than 1 bank at the same time. So Bob Dalton wanted to beat Jesse James and rob 2 banks at the same time.
In broad daylight.
In broad daylight, yeah. And the members of the Dalton gang were distant cousins of the Youngers. So there was a bit of a family connection. They somewhat grew up in that same area, Kansas, Missouri. So maybe there was some little bit of rivalry there, at least in the minds of some of the Dalton brothers. But that's my favorite story. And it very much mirrors the disaster of the Northfield raid. So if you've never read the story of the Coffeyville raid from 1892, definitely check out both. Read Jesse James' adventure of the Northfield raid first, and then go read about the Coffeyville raid of 1892. They're both wild. They both have very similar circumstances, with one major exception toward the end, which I won't ruin for anyone.
And then there's a similarity too that I'm remembering between the Dalton gang after they died and Bonnie and Clyde, which I'll save that to the very, very end because I'll have to ask Chris if I'm right on that. So, okay, we got to get back to the book.
And I have to tell me to start speaking slower. I feel like I'm just racing here.
If we're talking too fast, let us know that because we do have a tendency to talk fast anyway. And then when we get into story time, we talk even faster. So
slow down.
Yes.
Slow down.
Okay. So about a book, we obviously write and produce podcasts, but neither of us had ever written a book before. And what we've learned is that writing and publishing a book is a lot of work and takes a very, very long time. So once you got this idea, how did this come to be? Because we're right at the 2-year mark.
Right. So I first had the idea in the summer of 2019. We started talking about it in the summer of 2019. And then it was late summer, early fall of 2020, when Mandy and I were on a phone call with a gentleman who used to work at Apple Podcasts. And in the podcast business at that time, Apple Podcasts was the major podcast app. Spotify, I don't even know if they were putting podcasts on their site yet. Even if they were, it was very, very small. They had not yet made their huge investment into the world of podcasting. There were a couple other places, but Apple Podcasts was the holy grail. And we were outsiders in the podcast industry. I just started Legends of the Old West as a side project. I was working at a small town newspaper in Texas when I decided I wanted to start a podcast, and the side project of the podcast quickly turned into a full-time venture, which Omar talked about a little bit in the beginning, where the one podcast, we decided we could turn this into a business. Let's try to work for ourselves and see if this is actually going to take off. So that little side project turned into a business. And a year and a half later, we were still outsiders. We didn't know anyone in the podcast industry. We didn't know how to make a living out of this, how to turn this into a business. And we were very fortunate enough to meet a gentleman named Steve Wilson, who used to work at Apple Podcasts. You will see his name in the back of the book in the acknowledgement section. We were on a random business phone call with Steve Wilson right before he was going to be off the grid for 6 weeks. So this was a crucial phone call for us to get in right before he was off the grid for a long time. At the very end of the conversation, I don't even remember how it happened, but I ended up somehow mentioning the idea of having this book idea. We did get the quick pitch for Steve Wilson, and he said, "Oh, I know someone you should talk to. There's a woman named Kathy Doyle who works for Macmillan Publishers. Macmillan Publishers is one of the big 5 publishing companies in America, and it is the only one that has its own podcast division, and Kathy Doyle runs the podcast division." So Steve said, "Oh yeah, I'll connect you to Kathy Doyle." So he did, and she responded very graciously, and I did about a 30-minute pitch for Kathy over Zoom, and then she brought in a vice president of St. Martin's Press to hear that pitch again. So we did the pitch all over again. Mandy and I did the pitch all over again, and then they liked it, and then I ended up writing a big proposal for one of the top editors at St. Martin's Press, and he liked the idea, and so I got the green light for it in February or March of 2021. And then it just got released a little while ago. So it was almost exactly 2 years, like 26 months from the green light to the publication. And that was total madness, writing the book on top of everything else with a little bit of a pandemic thrown in for a little bit of flavor, just to mess things up even further. So it was.
But you did have to write basically half the book to even get in the proposal. To submit the
A
proposal.
little behind the scenes for those of you who have never written a book or think about writing a book, is certainly in the nonfiction world, you have to write a proposal, which is almost as long as the book. It's a very, very detailed, step-by-step, chapter-by-chapter outline with sample chapters written. So luckily, once you're done with that, you've got like a third of the book written, and you get a really big head start. So it is quite the project to write a proposal.
So I don't want to get too detailed because I know a lot of people are just now buying the book and everything else, which is great. That's what we expected. So I did want to go back to the story or that question you tried to steal from me.
Yes.
And that is that why was it, and this is a book about the Old West. So why was it important to bring in the inaugural league of the of baseball?
The inaugural season of the National League.
National Baseball, the National League, because it's not called the same thing it is now.
The National League is the same.
The National League, the inaugural baseball season of the
Yes.
National League.
This is the outtakes. Omar, clip that for the outtake. That's the outtakes reel right there. Where you have no idea how many of those we have in the storage.
National Baseball League. So
Yeah. So initially there was the National Association of Baseball Players. Then that converted itself essentially to the National League. So there's maybe a little bit of the confusion.
See?
So when the National League started,
obviously I'd be confused.
yes, its first season of play was 1876, and it ran just like it does now. It started in April.
Mhm.
The World Series, well, there wasn't a World Series, but they just crowned the champion, whoever won the most games by the end of the year. And the end of the year was September, October, around that time. And they, some teams played longer than others because the games got rained out, but they made sure everybody played the games, and they crowned a champion at the end of the year.
Mhm.
And I thought it was important because I knew we had a lot of baseball lovers in America. And I knew that people who would be interested in this time period largely are baseball fans. We've talked to lots of them.
Yeah.
Once we did that story of the 1919 World Series, we learned we had lots of fans who were interested in baseball.
Mhm.
And if you're interested in baseball and you're interested in history, it was just a natural fit to try to put little highlights from that inaugural season of 1876 in the book. And like I alluded to earlier, the National League is one of the few things that's still around right now that we can reach out and touch and trace its roots directly back to the Old West era, and specifically the year of 1876. So I wanted to have some of that modern overlap with the Old West era overlap. And so I picked some interesting highlights in there. So you're going to hear about the first no-hitter in National League history and a bunch of other things that happened. So the first no-hitter, this is the only thing I'll touch on, I won't spoil any more, happened right in that mid-July time period. Everything I was outlining earlier, the first no-hitter in National League history happened on July 15th in St. Louis, Missouri. And it was buried in the middle of a story in the middle of the newspaper, as you would expect. It was the first time it happened. It wasn't the huge deal that it would be today. Today, if somebody throws a no-hitter, it's the lead story on SportsCenter for days. It's all over the internet. It's all over everywhere. Back then, they couldn't even figure out how to really describe what had happened.
Yeah.
So describing a no-hitter took 3 or 4 sentences. They didn't have the term no-hitter.
Yeah.
It was describing what had happened.
They
So
should have had me try to describe it because I did
Yes,
so well
they would
with
have been-
the name of their
yes,
league.
they would have understood immediately. The clarity would have been off the charts.
But isn't that crazy to think that you've got Custer's Last Stand happening and then you've got baseball happening?
Yeah,
Just a couple states, well, not really states away, but it's
Yeah.
just like in the same country. It's crazy.
Yes.
The dichotomy of that. Like you think of baseball as such a, mainstream, something happening today, and you've got this massive war happening at the same
Yeah.
time.
So 3 weeks after Custer's command was annihilated at the Little Bighorn is when the first no-hitter happened. So in southern Montana, the soldiers are fresh off of burying the dead and trying to understand what had just happened. And 3 weeks after that, while those soldiers are resting and recuperating near the Yellowstone River, a few hundred miles away in St. Louis, Missouri, people have just learned what had happened, and the first no-hitters happened. They're still playing baseball. The whole East Coast is moving along as if nothing happened.
Yeah.
The strange disconnect. Anyone who reads about American history knows that there was, of course, the Civil War that happened in the mid 1860s that divided North from South. But after that, in the Old West era, there wasn't the animosity divide between North and South, but there was the East-West divide, where things happening in the West were almost like happening on another planet
Right.
compared to what was happening in the East. And it was so different. So these baseball games were happening in the East. Everybody was visiting the Centennial, the World's Fair in Philadelphia by the millions. Life was continuing as it would. Meanwhile, these epic clashes are happening out West, and nobody finds out about them for several days. And then they try to absorb the enormity and the gravity of what had happened. And I always find that interesting. It shows you the vastness of the nation, not only in its physical size, but just in, I don't know, the difference in character. Like imagine being uber wealthy in New York City in 1876, and how different that was for a saloon owner in an illegal mining camp called Deadwood. It's just the disparity is always I found fascinating. Maybe some of you are rolling your eyes and bored to death. I can't say you, but maybe you're fascinated by it too. I've always found that stuff interesting.
We'll just assume everybody's fascinated.
Yes, we're assuming everyone loves all of this.
Right. And so, okay, I've got 2 more questions, and then we're going to ask for your questions. So be thinking. But there's one big thing that this is taking you guys way behind the scenes into the making of, I guess, our podcast and the book. But every time I would walk into Chris's office when he was writing this book, he has these huge maps up, and he just looked so serious, trying to figure out where these maps were and what's going on. And every time I walked in, there's all these maps up, and I'm thinking, what is going on with these maps? He's just like, I'm working on maps for the book. I'm working on maps for the book. And so when I got the book, I was like, okay, this thing's going to be all maps. Like there's going to be no words. It's going to be all maps. And there's like 4 maps in the book.
There's 4 maps.
There's 4 maps. Yeah.
Yes.
And they're pretty amazing maps, but they also look fairly simple, but in their simplicity, these things are so complicated to make. And there's also some really cool pictures. So explain the maps, so when people do get the book and see what I'm talking about, they know how much work went into this.
Yeah, we want to highlight the gentleman who made the maps, and they're very, to me, that's another interesting facet. So we just randomly, through making the podcast, we end up interacting on social media, or sometimes over email, sometimes phone calls with listeners who reach out and say they enjoy the podcast. One of those listeners was a guy named Billy Roberts. Turns out Billy Roberts is a professional map maker for the government. And he's a big fan of the podcast, and he runs a side business called Bad Hoss Maps. And he uses his technical expertise in making professional maps down to the GPS decimal point, like pi almost. He's got these crazy ways to build these things. And he took, for instance, he splits his time between Lincoln, New Mexico, the home of the Billy the Kid story, and Boulder, Colorado. So in Lincoln, he and his business partner become authorities about the Billy the Kid story. So they were able to go see all of the different places, the key moments, the key places from the Billy the Kid story, many of which are now on private land and the general public cannot access. So he found those places, he mapped the GPS coordinates, and then he made this incredibly detailed, like old looking, amazing map of the Billy the Kid story with some highlights of the story. It is incredible. If you look up Bad Hoss Maps on the internet, you'll find his website. You'll see a version of the map. It's incredible. So when it came time for me to make maps for the book, I thought I only know one person who can make maps. I have no idea how to even start making maps for a book. So I called Billy and said, hey, would you be willing to put your expertise to use in making maps for my book? And I've already somewhat plotted out the GPS points of where a lot of things in the book happened for myself so that I could reference them in the book. I had to know how far away is Deadwood from the Little Bighorn battlefield and all these places. So I gave him a lot of information. He generated really interesting and detailed to the GPS coordinate maps. So I don't know how detailed other maps are in other books, but these are made by a professional map maker who knows exactly what he's doing. So hopefully you enjoy them. And they took a lot of time and effort for us to put together and to get the right size and all that kind of stuff. So I thought they were really interesting. And that was a really fun experience for me, as he's teaching me a lot about how to do these. And I got to work with a person who's a fan of the podcast. So it really tied it all in together, as I feel like I'm now almost nascently quoting The Big Lebowski. The maps tied the book together, just like the rug tied the room together in The Big Lebowski, one of my favorite movies that I watched endlessly a long time ago in the early 2000s. So if you thought you were going to hear a Big Lebowski reference in this, you can now check your bingo card. You've got it. Nobody thought that was coming.
Did you want to mention anything about the pictures?
We probably won't show them up, right now, but if you get the book, the pictures, I also do want to highlight their, got it there. They might be backwards for you. I'm not sure if they are or not, but
is this backwards for everybody, or are you are you reading this correctly?
Hopefully you're reading it correctly.
Somebody let us know.
It's correct.
It's correct. Cool. We got the heads up from
Yeah.
Omar. So
And that's
in the book, I was fortunate enough to find some pictures that really helped me as I was trying to describe, for instance, the Northfield raid, as Jesse James and his gang are riding into this town and doing all the different things that happened. Obviously, it helps to visualize it if you can kind of see
Right.
some reference for it. And so I found some maps in the archives of I think it was the Northfield Historical Society, or found some pictures of the town. So luckily someone took photos of the town either in 1876 or 1877. So the town looks exactly like it would have during the robbery. And I was able to get those pictures into the book. So as you read it, flip to that section in the center of the book that has the photos, because you can see exactly where the First National Bank is that the gang robbed. You can see the bridge that they rode across to get into the town. You can see the big town square area. And you can kind of see, though the perspective is very flat, where they would have made the right-hand turn to ride down the street to get to the bank. You can see the hotel that was a key piece
Right.
of the story, which I won't get into now if you haven't read the story. But you can see all of these things in these photos, which is fantastic. And the last thing I want to highlight is what I thought was a really cool find that happened right at the end of the process. And I've never seen it in another book. So I'm hoping nobody else used it in their book too. But the very last photo in the photo section is the broadsheet newspaper from the Bismarck Tribune, the special extra that the publisher printed the day after he received the news about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Again, I won't ruin too much about it, but the guy who published the Bismarck Tribune newspaper was the first person to receive the mountain of information about the battle. You know, there's a lot of components to it. You'll read them in the book. He received the information. He spent a night compiling official reports and dispatches and reading through all this information that was presented to him to draft the first draft of history. So he wrote like a 10,000 word article for the New York Herald that he had his telegraph operator then had to transmit word by word to New York over the course of 22 hours. It took this telegraph operator 22 straight hours of tapping to send that article to New York.
What if there
so
was a
that
typo?
There probably were several. Yes, that would have been horrifying, but there probably were a few. So it took 22 straight hours to transmit that massive story to New York so that the news of the Little Bighorn would start to spread.
Mhm.
In the meantime, while that guy was tapping, the publisher of the Bismarck Tribune wrote his own special edition of his newspaper and published it. And I found the broadsheet in the North Dakota Historic Society archives, and it is the final photo. So that to me is another really interesting piece of history. You can see exactly what he wrote. You can probably zoom in on it a little bit and see and try to read something. So we just had something pop up a little bit on our screen, so I got distracted. I'm easily distracted by small animals or poll questions, shiny objects. So that's just another quick highlight that I really wanted to showcase. I think it's really fun. Yeah, can we move that over to the?
Is that something, Omar, is this poll something you want us to ask? I just want to verify before I.
No, just entertaining the audience.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Okay. Got it.
So
Um,
that was me just getting totally distracted.
Okay. So what I have one more question, but I want to ask Raul's question because it's a really good one. So, so he's not yet read the book, but he is asking, how did you explore Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and weave them into the overall story? Have you devoted time to them before in your podcast?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that because I completely forgot to mention something earlier. Or maybe we didn't have time to get to it, but yes, I mean, researching this book was a really interesting project, and I won't dive too deep down the rabbit hole here, but like I kind of alluded to before, because there are so many different storylines in the book, I had to research each one of them individually. So it was like researching 6 or 7 books at the same time just to research this one. So I did a lot of research on both Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and we have told both of their stories almost in their entirety on the podcast. So in a season of Legends of the Old West called Red Cloud's War, you get a really serious introduction to Crazy Horse as a prominent warrior during the Red Cloud's War from 1866 to 1868. Sitting Bull is mentioned in there, but he's more of a side character in that season. And then I did do the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn on the podcast, which of course Sitting Bull is a very prominent part of. And a lot of Sitting Bull's backstory is in that season too. So between those, Red Cloud's War and the Little Bighorn, you'll get a lot of the stories of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And I wove a lot of that same material and a little bit more into the book, but without going too deep into them. That was another thing I really should point out. The point of this book is the context. It's to show the overlap and how many crazy things were happening at the same time. It is not intended to be a deep dive into any one of those subjects. There are fantastic books that do all of that. And you'll see a list of those in the bibliography. You'll see a little bit about what I'm saying right now in the introduction to the book. There's a very specific point to this, which was the overlap and not the deep dive. And then is there, how
No,
did we,
that was,
did I,
but then
cover-
that brings me, there was one person that mentioned that this is kind of their first foray into the American West. And so that's why this is a great book to start with, because it will give you, a lot of those background and all the biggest things that happened. And then if you find one that you really love, then you can, obviously buy another book to do an even deeper dive. So let's see here.
yeah,
I'm just,
Jay's got a question. that I
okay.
could
Have
maybe
you
start.
already read it? So go ahead.
Yeah, I just read it. And that actually, I of course, because whenever I start talking, I've forgotten the second part of something I was going to say. So
Yeah.
I was actually, about 3 weeks ago, able to visit the Little Bighorn for the first time in a long time. I had planned on going there, of course, before I wrote the book, but then the pandemic was raging and then our workload went off the charts and it just got all messed up. So I was not able to go see the battlefield for a second time while researching the book, but I did just go see it a couple weeks ago. And I would highly recommend it. If you have never been there, to actually go stand in some of those places, you can truly visualize, at least to the best of our abilities. I don't think any of our modern imaginations are good enough to understand actually what it was like to have fought in that battle. But being there, you can get at least a little sense of it. And so to Jay's question about
Here, I'll just read it really
yeah.
quickly. So we hear about Custer dividing his force into thirds. Was the loss of Reno's men the real reason why Custer lost the battle, or was it Custer's arrogance?
It's difficult. And this is a thing that I think I realized in researching the book that I hadn't fully understood until I did research the book, which was I think the reason is a combination of things. Custer's arrogance is absolutely part of it, but Custer's arrogance comes from experience as well. I think he was probably a naturally arrogant person, but he had an experience, and everyone is formed by their experiences.
Right.
So let me say that. Every decision you make now is based on something you went through previously. Your past experiences inform your future decisions. So in 1867 or 1868, Custer had led the charge at the Battle of the Washita in Oklahoma, where he captured a small group of women and children from a village. But he didn't know that just around the bend from that small village were larger villages, and he didn't know that 1,000 warriors were streaming at him to annihilate his command at that time. He was lucky enough to be able to capture the women and children from a small village and then rush back across the river to safety and escape annihilation from about 1,000 warriors. So he'd had that experience in his mind. And as he's trying to find this huge village of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in the Little Bighorn now, 8 years later in 1876, number one, he didn't know the size of the village. He knew it was growing, but he had no concept of exactly how big it was, even though he'd received some warnings that this village was probably bigger than anybody had ever seen. He still didn't know how big it was. So some of his arrogance came to the forefront when he said, I'm going to attack no matter what. But then part of it was circumstance, in that because he was riding so deep into what was kind of no man's land at that time without any backup, there reached a point where he was certain that his command had been spotted. So at that point, he only has two choices. He can continue and attack and try to win glorious victory, or he can retreat. And when you read the book, you realize some of the reasons why he chose to attack, not just for arrogance and the desire for glory, but
Don't tell them all of that.
Yes,
They
I'm
haven't
not-
read
yes,
it yet.
but there's some other factors there too. So I think you factor in his natural arrogance, his past experience of just needing to capture a small group of people could potentially win the battle for him. And then the fact that his command had been discovered. So if he didn't do something, he was in trouble. And by that point, there was just simply no way Custer was going to retreat. So he decided to attack. And then dividing his column into thirds was, again, I think a little bit more toward playing off of his past experience, that he sent Reno's command to chase down some warriors who were about to alert the huge village. It wasn't just that he created a three-pronged attack plan to attack the village. There was a specific purpose to the first phase of the attack. It just didn't work the way he wanted. And from that point forward, it was just about adjusting. It was Reno's men went to try to do something. It didn't work. So now what's Custer going to do? He tried something else. That didn't work. What's he going to do now? He tried another thing and that didn't work. It was just adjusting and moving from plan A to plan B to plan C to plan D, always with the hope of just trying to capture a few of the women and children so that it would hopefully force the warriors who were in the village to back off and stop their attack. By capturing women and children, he could claim victory in the battle. And of course, it just never worked out that way. So you're welcome to, again, my classic answer of a long rambling answer that I hope made sense. Maybe it answered your question, maybe it didn't, but that's what you get here on the Fireside Chat House of Cards when it all falls apart.
You never really know where we're going to end up going, but the full answer is in the book.
Yeah, many more. As long as that answer was, there's a whole lot more in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I guess any other questions or, I mean, I have a couple other things that I could ask, but I definitely want to open it up. Omar, let us know.
Do you have the Q&A window open? I think.
I'm just in the chat. Maybe I'm not even, maybe I'm totally missing questions.
No questions.
Okay. So everyone's just in the chat. Omar, let us know.
Yeah, I think I saw a question from Raul.
I asked Raul's question.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Yeah.
Sitting Bull.
About Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No more questions.
The two gentlemen from the LA area are chiming in. Good to hear from you guys.
Yeah.
I think if I remembered that correctly.
So I'll ask one more question, and if anyone thinks of anything, then just go ahead and jump in. But a little bit of our background as well is that, a lot of people say like, oh, wow, you guys are, even though we're not that young, but, fairly young to like be, loving history as much as you do. And we grew up going on, any sort of vacations that we went on with our family, we would listen to Louis L'Amour tapes in the car as we're driving cross country. And we'd always go to the West, and we were fascinated with the American West and ghost towns as we were little kids. And then as we got older, all the stories of the American West. And so we've been living and breathing the American West literally our entire lives. And then Chris has just become, not actually a historian, but basically, and then writing all of Legends of the Old West as well and researching everything. And so one question that I have always had is that when you decided to write this book, was there anything that you were a little bit shocked by or you found particularly interesting that you, I guess, didn't already know throughout all of that?
I think actually leading into the Little Bighorn discussion, I think it was a couple things. It's someone will answer that question and then lead me into a slightly different piece that I think I referenced a second ago, that Custer's decision-making, I had always heard a lot of the same things, that the reason the Battle of the Little Bighorn unfolded the way it did and ended the way it did was basically just because of Custer's arrogance. And that's a huge part of it. But I did not know all the details of it. And I think the devil really is in the details there, and learning how one thing led to another and how each decision affected the next possible decisions. Each problem, every time he tried to solve a problem, he ended up digging himself a deeper hole. So he had there were no bad options. There were no good choices, basically.
Right.
They were just a series of bad options, and they kept getting more difficult and more difficult. So just learning how it actually happened and what his real choices would have been, and what a guy like Custer would have actually done in that scenario. Was the battle essentially a foregone conclusion? To some extent it was. And I think just learning all of that. And the second piece I wanted to add was that having been at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, if you can get there, standing on Reno Hill and looking down at the Little Bighorn River and looking at all the ravines and looking at all the hills that surround Reno Hill and standing there where that part of the battle unfolded was a truly sobering experience. You can see the depression in the middle of the hill where the soldiers had to form a battlefield hospital. They've got a little stone marker with a cross on it there. It's incredible. It really shows you the magnitude of this. It really becomes obvious how crazy that would have been. And so that wasn't necessarily part of the research process, but it was part of the understanding of the battle. That you, even no matter how many books you read, no matter how many podcasts you listen to, there's no way to understand what would have been like unless you actually stand there and look down at the ravines where these warriors were swarming up to try to attack the soldiers, and look at the hills where warriors were lobbing arrows and gunfire constantly on these poor soldiers who were trapped at the hill. And they actually have gun pits that those soldiers from 1876 dug out of the earth. There's actual, like dips and divots in the ground that they have left preserved. Some they've reconstructed so you can see what it was like. Others they have left exactly as they were. So you can actually see gun pits from 1876 that the soldiers dug while they were sitting there fighting for their lives. And that part was just the most incredible to me.
And I think, in history classes, I feel like you just get like the summation of all of this, I mean, you don't really ever get those sorts of details, and to really stand on the hill and to like live it, had to be terrifying, and like to actually be there. I mean, it's been so many years since I've been there. Chris was just there recently, but I know he's said you have to go. If you can make it, you have to go.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say about that is that luckily there's a driving road. I think when we were there as kids, we've been there a couple of times. When the first time we were there as kids in the late 80s, our dad, who I had to ask about this, doesn't seem to think that there was a road that led from the Custer's Last Stand monument, where his piece of the battle happened, all the way out to Reno Hill, which is about 4 miles away. Now there's a paved road so you can drive out there, and there's signs on both sides of the road that give you a little illustration of the battle. And then when you start out at Reno's Hill and make that drive and stop at each of those signs, you can see the trail of grave markers that lead from Reno Hill to each part of the battle. And it's like a trail of morbid breadcrumbs where you can see how it all unfolded. You can see the movement of the soldiers, because those grave markers represent where those guys were found and buried. Did we get one last question at the very end?
I'm reading it right now. Okay, so from Jay, we don't seem to have any photographs of Crazy Horse. Why was this famous Indian chief so reluctant to have his photo taken?
I guess I can't technically answer why he was, but yeah, there are no known photographs of Crazy Horse. He's one of the few. And I think part of the reason—
Isn't there one of him really old?
No. There've been sketches of him. Sketches are the best we have. Part of the reason I'm trying not to spoil too much about it. Part of the reason we don't have any photographs is that he died before many of the warriors who we do have photographs of were photographed. So when you see photographs of Sitting Bull and Gaul and all these famous warriors, it's because they survived into the 1880s and 1890s when they were able to be photographed. There are no photographs of them in the early 1870s or the 1860s. They are still free roaming native peoples who will not allow themselves to be photographed. They are only photographed. Oops. Gosh, I did it too. Oh, I almost got to the end. 1 minute left. I had a perfect record until the very end.
Not just me.
They were photographed at the end of their lives when they were living on reservations. So Crazy Horse simply died before that happened.
All right. Well, I think we're supposed to be stopping at 8. So
good time conversion. I didn't think you were going to do it.
I know. I was like, let us know. Hi, Omar.
Hi. Yes, it could be tricky when you're in a different time zone.
I'm working on my math.
Yeah, you all are 2 hours behind.
We're 3.
We're 3 behind now.
Yeah.
Oh, 3.
Yeah.
Yep. So
yeah.
Hopefully everyone enjoyed it. Do we do an official goodbye and thank you? I'm not sure where we're at in the program here.
Yeah, sure.
If we haven't done the official goodbye and thank you, if you're all still there, thank you very much for showing up. This was a unique experience for us.
And join us on social media and, follow the podcast. We love interacting with everybody. So we're Black Barrel Media on Instagram and Facebook, and B Barrel Media on Twitter. And then at Old West Podcast on all of those as well. Yeah. So it's the 2 of us. So you're going to get a response from one of us. So we love interacting with people.
You'll see more real fireside chat videos down the road, but it's not 115 this summer. So once we get to fall, we'll start doing more of those. You'll have to see much more rambling.
Yeah. Yes. And if you thought this was fun, just wait till we have bourbon.
Yes. Feel free to bring your small animals along. Hello, Timmy. Yes. Bye, Timmy. Hopefully he enjoyed it too.
Yes. Well, he's ready to go to bed now.
Timmy. Yes. That's so cute.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
See you later.
Thanks so much, Chris and Mandy. And thanks to everyone in our audience. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you to the Mark Twain Museum. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.